Black Myth Wukong is a game, and I'm going to assume that you already know this, so I'm going to skip the entire introduction of the game and all that sort of stuff and just get into the GPU benchmark results as quickly as I can, because this isn't a review of the game. Rather, the purpose of this content is to benchmark a stupid amount of graphics cards under the same test conditions to see how they compare in terms of performance, allowing you to see how much faster a potential upgrade is when compared to what you have right now. The Black Myth Wukong benchmark tool is also free to use via Steam, which is amazing, and I wish all game developers offered such a tool. This means after a 7GB download, you can run the benchmark on your system, allowing you to work out how well your current system plays the game before you even buy it. And then if you do need a GPU upgrade, this guide should show you how much more performance you can get out of the current generation GPUs, as well as most models from previous generations. Now, Black Myth Wukong is an Unreal 5 game, and it looks amazing. It is an NVIDIA-sponsored title, so that means there's a heavy emphasis on ray tracing, though FSR and XeSS upscaling is already supported in conjunction with DLSS, so that's great to see. You do get frame generation for both FSR and DLSS, along with TSR. For benchmarking, I'm testing 5 different configurations, each at 3 resolutions with up to 43 GPUs. So there is a boatload of data. I've already logged over 40 hours in the benchmark tool across 2 systems, both using the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, and they have been calibrated to deliver the same results. We have 2 ray tracing configurations for you, one using the cinematic preset with upscaling set to 75%, using frame generation and very high quality ray tracing. I've used DLSS for the GeForce 40 series and FSR for everything else, as that allows me to enable frame generation. We then have another test which uses all of the same settings, except for ray tracing, which has been dialed down 1 notch to the medium preset. And for those of you wondering, there are 3 ray tracing options available. They're titled low, medium, and very high. You'll see on screen a table that I've created which shows you what each option does, and again, we will be testing with the very high and medium options. Then we have 3 native configurations that don't use upscaling, frame generation, or ray tracing, though we are using FSR at 100% scaling for the Radeon GPUs and DLSS at 100% for the GeForce GPUs. The presets tested here include cinematic, high, and medium. I won't be going over visuals and individual quality settings for this content. For that, Tim will have an optimization guide which will be based on the actual Black Myth Wukong game, so expect that early next week. Finally, for testing the GeForce GPUs, I'm using the Game Ready driver 560.87, and for the Radeon GPUs, Adrenalin Edition 24.7.1, and AMD is yet to release a dedicated driver for this title. But we're not going to wait, as we have no idea when that'll happen. I've also included the Intel Arc A770 and A750, though they were only benchmarked using the medium and high presets, as the performance with the current driver was quite poor, though not entirely unexpected given the AMD and NVIDIA GPUs that they typically match up with. So, let's get in the data. Okay, we'll start with the very high quality RT results, which, as I just noted, use the cinematic preset with 75% upscaling, and frame generation is also enabled. So the actual frame rate is much lower than what's being reported here because we are using frame generation, so please keep that in mind. Now, Tim tells me that anything below 60 FPS with frame generation enabled is pretty bloody awful, and that makes complete sense based on what we've seen previously. Ideally, you will want a base frame rate of 60 FPS, which roughly translate to 100 FPS in this graph. That being the case, at 1080p, this game is extremely difficult to play under these conditions. The RTX 4090 is really the only good example here, with what amounts to the smoothness of 141 FPS. And again, I have to stress the data here is using frame generation. This means at minimum, you will want an RTX 4080 Super or base model 4080, while you may find the experience acceptable with the 4070 Ti Super, 4070 Ti, or maybe the 4070 Super. The combat, based on footage that we've seen online, appears to be quite fast-paced, and therefore I expect anything below 60 FPS with frame generation enabled to feel really bad. So that means the RTX 3080 and below on this graph are going to result in a bad time for most gamers. Also, as expected, for those of you with a Radeon GPU, even if it's the 7900 XTX, you won't be playing Black Myth Wukong using the maximum ray traced quality settings. For example, the 7900 XTX was only comparable to the RTX 4060 here, so that is super bad. Jumping up to 1440p, the RTX 4090 is the only GPU that can deliver what we deem to be a good experience, or at least an acceptable experience with frame generation enabled. The RTX 4080 Super and 4080 will probably feel noticeably laggy during combat and fast action scenes. The 4070 Super only managed 65 FPS, and Tim has already confirmed that this is a bad experience, in his opinion anyway, which I would agree with given I generally demand more performance than Tim does. So that means at 1440p using these quality settings, the RTX 4070 will be insufficient for most gamers, and anything slower will be unusable, or at the very least you'd be probably looking to reduce the quality settings for a better experience. Now at 4K, it's highly debatable how good the RTX 4090 is. Tim has played the game under these conditions, but is bound by NDA at this point, so he can't directly comment on the experience, but let's just say Tim has in the past said most games with frame generation at 70 FPS are bad. So I don't believe the data here for the 4090 is going to result in a great experience, but of course that is subjective. Ideally, you will want to drop the resolution scaling at 4K down to around 50%, which will result in a DLSS performance type setting. Under these quality settings, the 4080 Super and anything below it is out in my opinion. Sub 60 FPS with frame generation enabled is bad. Also keep in mind at this point in time there is no NVIDIA reflex setting in the game. Okay, so if we dial the ray tracing preset down a notch from very high to medium, this results in the fully ray traced lighting and fully ray traced reflections to be rendered at half resolution, while it also disables fully ray traced caustics entirely. This only boosted the performance of the RTX 4090 at 1080p by 8%, so not a big uplift there, though we are seeing a massive 52% improvement for the 7900 XTX. Even so, this only elevated the 7900 XTX to 70 FPS. And remember, we're still using frame generation here, FSR frame generation in this specific example, so the experience overall won't be good. Tim's opinion here is that frame generation at 60 FPS is unplayable/unpleasant. 80 FPS is the absolute minimum, but still quite sluggish. Around 100 FPS is fine, but isn't as responsive as real high refresh rate gaming. And then when up near 150 FPS, it feels quite nice. So based on that, the RTX 4090 would deliver a nice experience at 152 FPS, so that's great. The RTX 4080 Super and 4080 would also be decent, and you're getting a fine experience with the RTX 4070 Ti and Ti Super. The RTX 3080 hovered around our absolute minimum recommendation with frame gen enabled, meaning the 7900 XTX and everything below it is bad. Moving up to 1440p, the 4090 is still delivering a solid experience, while the 4080s are decent, or fine as Tim said. The 4070 series delivers the minimum acceptable experience in our opinion, and anything slower will start to feel quite sluggish. Certainly anything below the 3080 Ti is a write-off here, at least in our opinion. Then once again at 4K, nothing is particularly great here, and as a result you will want to drop the upscaling from the quality mode to performance, and possibly even downgrade the quality preset. But even then, the RTX 4090 will really be the only usable GPU under these conditions. Okay, let's do away with upscaling, ray tracing and frame generation, and instead look at native rendering performance using the maximum in-game quality preset, so the cinematic preset. That said, please note the game still uses software Lumen with ray tracing disabled, and the only way to disable this would be to run the game in the DirectX 11 mode, which is possible, and we'll look at that towards the end of the video. Under these conditions, you'd ideally want to target a minimum of 60 FPS, and anything above that becomes a bonus, something you high refresh rate gamers will enjoy. How low you can go below 60 FPS is subjective. Personally, if it drops much below 60 FPS, I start looking at ways to jack the frame rate back up, either by lowering quality settings or reducing the resolution. So at 1080p, the 4090 rendered just 90 FPS, so not a lot, but it was certainly a nice experience. The 4080 series delivered just over 70 FPS, which is again decent, certainly playable, but not amazing on a high refresh rate display. Of course, you can enable DLSS upscaling here, and that will help boost the performance, but scaling here will be similar relative to other parts, so we might as well just keep things apples to apples with native resolution testing for this specific data. The 7900 XTX is decent here with 65 FPS on average, making it slightly faster than the 4070 Ti Super, which isn't amazing as it generally competes with the RTX 4080, but I think it's the software Lumen that will be slowing the Radeon GPU down a bit. For just shy of 60 FPS, the 7900 XT, 4070 Super and 3090 Ti work, but below that we're getting into the 40 FPS range, which is less than ideal for the combat sections of the game, but is fine for just walking around. I tested a lot more GPUs here, but for most of them they can't handle these quality settings, so we might as well move on. Moving up to 1440p drops the RTX 4090 down to just 73 FPS, which is still highly playable. That's just not a lot of performance from such an extreme GPU, not using hardware-based ray tracing effects, for example. Meanwhile, the RTX 4080 Super and RTX 4080 struggled to hit 60 FPS, and in fact didn't with 56 FPS. The Radeon 7900 XTX also fell short with just 51 FPS, so not terrible baseline performance there, and with FSR upscaling you could get a decent result. Below the 4070 Ti Super, you will be heavily relying on upscaling if you wish to use the cinematic preset at 1440p, or what would be 1440p if you weren't upscaling. Then at 4K, you will absolutely need to employ upscaling, even with the RTX 4090. In fact, even with the help of upscaling, most GPUs won't be able to deliver playable performance at 4K using these settings. So, as you might have expected, or at least gathered by this point, Black Myth Wukong is a difficult game to play maxed out. Now, dropping down to the high quality preset dramatically boosts performance. The RTX 4090, for example, is now 53% faster with an average of 138 FPS. So if you don't like technology such as frame generation, this is probably the preset to use with higher end GPUs. I suspect the level of software-based Lumen has also been reduced, or possibly even disabled, as the 7900 XTX saw a 74% performance uplift and is now able to roughly match the 4080 and 4080 Super with 113 FPS. The 7900 XT is also only slightly slower than the RTX 4070 Ti and Ti Super, while the GRE version is comparable to the 3090, 3090 Ti and 3080 Ti, making it just 7% faster than the RTX 4070. Now there are 43 GPUs in this graph, and we have a lot more data to go over, so I won't discuss all of the results because we'd just be here forever. Therefore, feel free to pause the video at any point and take a look at the data that we gloss over. And it is good to see that the 6800 XT and RTX 3080 are neck and neck in this title, at least under these test conditions, and we see that the 7700 XT is 8% faster than both the RTX 4060 Ti variants. The old RTX 2080 Ti averaged 56 FPS, which placed it alongside the likes of the 6700 XT and 3060 Ti, as well as the new RTX 4060. Then further down the graph, we find the old Radeon RX 5700 XT, hanging in there quite well with 44 FPS, which is RTX 3060-like performance, and impressively, just a few frames slower than the RTX 2070 Super, a GPU that did cost $100 US more back in the day. It's also crazy to see the RX 7600 offering a mere 7% uplift from that old rusty 5700 XT. It's actually not rusty, at least mine isn't, not yet. Intel's Arc A770 makes its first appearance in this graph with just 41 FPS on average, though that was a frame faster than the RTX 2060 Super. The RX 6600 and Arc A750 were also neck and neck, and then we find the embarrassing AMD and Nvidia releases, the RTX 3050 and the steaming pile that is the 6500 XT, though we do have the 8GB version here, still only producing 24 FPS on average, but who's shocked by that result? Also, I couldn't even test the original 4GB model under these conditions. Increasing the resolution to 1440p drops the RTX 4090 down to 108 FPS, while the RTX 4080 series fell just shy of 90 FPS, making the 7900 XTX just 5% slower, So not a bad result here for the Radeon GPU. Then for around 60 FPS on average, you can get away with the 6950 XT, 7900 GRE, RTX 3080 Ti, and RTX 3090. From Nvidia's current generation, you wouldn't really want to go lower than the RTX 4070 Super, especially if you don't want to make use of upscaling, though you probably should. Below that, scaling is pretty similar to what we're seeing at 1080p. Anything below 60 FPS will require upscaling for a more optimal experience, or alternatively, you could lower the quality settings further or drop back down to 1080p. Then once again, at the 4K resolution, we find the game to be extremely demanding, even with the high preset, as here the RTX 4090 averaged just 69 FPS, and while that's certainly nice, it's not exactly high refresh rate performance. The RTX 4080 was only good for 52 FPS, so you will want to utilize upscaling here, and this of course applies to anything slower. Okay, so this is the lowest quality setting that I tested, and what we have here is the medium quality preset with 100% resolution scaling. When compared to the high preset, the RTX 4090's performance has been boosted by a further 25%, and we're looking at a 28% improvement for the 7900 XTX, which is now on par with the 4080 Super. The 4090, 4080 series, and 7900 XTX are all able to deliver high refresh rate performance without the aid of upscaling. And right down to the RTX 3080, we're looking at 100 FPS plus. So as we often find with these latest and greatest AAA titles, they are very playable using medium quality type settings, and that's certainly the case here. For an average of 60 FPS at 1080p, you can get away with the RX 7600 or 7600 XT, and the RTX 4060 is faster again with 68 FPS, so not bad really. Again, the RTX 3050 struggled, and the 6500 XT was an embarrassment. Hell, the original 4GB model only averaged 14 FPS. What a joke that thing is, especially when the RX 6600 averaged 50 FPS. The Intel Arc A770 was also good for 51 FPS here. It's not amazing, but playable, and of course you can enable XeSS or FSR upscaling. Moving to 1440p, we're still looking at high refresh rate performance for the RTX 4090, and good performance out of the 4080 series along with the 7900 XTX. The 7900 XT and 4070 Ti were also neck and neck, with just over 90 FPS on average. And here we see there's about a dozen GPUs positioned from the RTX 3080 all the way up to the 4070 Ti, delivering between 73 and 92 FPS, so good performance there. That said, from the RTX 3080 down to the slowest GPU to still render 60 FPS or better, there are just three options here: the RTX 3070, 7700 XT, and RX 6800. Then for those of you that aim for at least 40 FPS, there are still loads of options here. And one such option is the old GTX 1080 Ti, which refuses to die, and it averaged exactly 40 FPS, along with the 6650 XT, Arc A770, and the RX 5700 XT, another GPU that really doesn't want to die. Then finally at 4K, you will again need to bring some serious rendering power, as the RTX 4090 averaged just 86 FPS, which is good performance overall, but we are only using the medium quality preset. The RTX 4080 series averaged 66 FPS, and the 7900 XTX was slightly slower with 61 FPS. Beyond that though, you will want to use upscaling to push frame rates past 60 FPS. Now just lastly, here's a quick look at DirectX 11 versus DirectX 12 performance using the medium quality preset. At 1080p, the results do vary greatly depending on the GPU used for testing. For example, the GTX 1080 Ti was 18% faster using DirectX 12, but the RTX 2060 Super was 8% faster using DirectX 11, so pretty odd stuff there. And then we see that the 5700 XT is 12% faster using DirectX 11. But if we increase the resolution to 1440p, we find slightly more favourable data for DirectX 11. The 1080 Ti is still faster using DirectX 12, though now just 8% faster, while the RTX 2060 Super became 14% faster using DX11. The 5700 XT also sees a strong 15% performance uplift when using DirectX 11 in favour of DirectX 12 at 1440p. So if you still have an old Radeon GPU, it might be worth trying out the DX11 mode. So there you have it. After 522 data points, you should have a pretty good idea of what the various GPUs on offer, well, have to offer, especially if you're in need of an upgrade. I've spent 3 long days at this point doing almost nothing but back-to-back runs in the benchmark tool, just doing that thing over and over again. So I really hope this data does help you out. And of course, we do have a detailed optimization guide coming up next week, which should complement this content really well. What I can tell you is the game looks amazing, and you'll get a sense of that from the footage shown in this video. And of course, there are plenty of videos online showing actual gameplay. You can also download the benchmark tool for yourself, try it out. It is a great option, and I love what the developer has done here. The only shortcoming of this tool, I would say, is that frame generation testing might give you a false sense of what is acceptable, as you can't actually play the game and get a feel for the input. So while frame generation looks really good here, it probably won't play as well as what you're expecting when dropping below, say, 80 FPS. But other than that, the benchmark tool represents actual gameplay, which is ideally what you want to see. Anyway, so far the game looks great, and the level of optimization appears to be quite good. So that's early signs are looking good, and there is a nice degree of scalability when using lower quality settings. Once I can actually test the game though, I'll probably look at stuff like VRAM usage, as you can't really accurately test VRAM usage from the benchmark tool. For this, you really need to play the game and do so for, I would say, at least 10 minutes before you can get an accurate read on the actual VRAM usage. So that's stuff we can look at in the future. But for now, I think we're done with this one. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like, subscribe for more content. As I said, we have an optimization guide coming up pretty well when the game will be released. That will be ready. Tim is working on it as we speak. So yeah, subscribe. Also, we have Floatplane Patreon. Check out either one of those. If you want more Hardware Unboxed goodness, you get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.